Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Toms River branch of the Ocean County Library. My name is Colleen, and I work in the Toms River Adult Services Department. Our department hosts a variety of programs for adults, including crafts, concerts, and author talks such as the one you're hearing tonight. This program is sponsored by the Friends of the Ocean County Library, Toms River. It's a lovely group of volunteers. They run book sales, they run fundraisers to offer programs such as the one that you're going to see tonight. And tonight, we are very fortunate to have author Sabeeha Rehman and Walter Ruby with us to speak about their book, We Refuse to Be Enemies: How Muslims and Jews Can Make Peace, One Friendship at a Time. Sabeeha Rehman is an author of the memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, which was a finalist for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing, received the San Francisco Book Festival Award, and was listed as top 10 religion and spirituality and top 10 diverse nonfiction books by Booklist. A blogger and public speaker, she is an op-ed contributor to the Wall Street Journal and has published articles in Forward, Salon.com, New York Daily News, and the Baltimore Sun. She lives with her husband, Khalid, in New York City. Walter Ruby is a veteran activist in Muslim-Jewish relations who has organized hundreds of twinning events, bringing together thousands of Jews and Muslims in more than 30 countries around the world. Ruby served for decades as a reporter and commentator for American Jewish and Israeli publications. His articles and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, USA Today, and Baltimore Sun. He lives with his wife, Tanya, in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Sabeeha and Walter. And I'll turn this over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Colleen. I know the area where you are is a very beautiful place to live, so I envy you all that beautiful coastline. So we wanted to just open with just a bit of an opening, a very short opening statement about what's been going on in Israel and Palestine, which obviously causes us pain. So like countless other American Muslims and Jews, Sabeeha and I have been devastated and traumatized by recent events in Israel and Palestine. Together, we appeal for an end to violence in Israel-Palestine and for a just solution to the conflict that guarantees peace, security, and self-determination for every Palestinian and every Israeli.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Colleen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We pledge as Jews, Muslims, and allies that we will not allow the conflict in Israel and Palestine to tear apart our alliance here in America. We are brothers and sisters who love and respect each other, and we are committed to standing up for each other when either community is under attack. We will redouble our efforts to fight together against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all forms of bigotry, including the growing white supremacist ideology that is a deadly threat to both our communities. We will continue to speak out in defense of democracy and pluralism in America. We need each other. I was raised in Pakistan. During my growing up years, I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan is pro-Palestinian, and to this day, Pakistan has not recognized Israel. So I always viewed the Jews through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped, all countries of the world except Israel. That is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the US in 1971. Walter, had you ever met a Muslim person?
No, I didn't meet a Muslim until I was well into my 20s. I grew up a lonely Jewish child in a overwhelmingly Gentile area, suburb of Pittsburgh, and I was moved by the book Exodus by Leon Uris, which was about the creation of the state of Israel. So, and then it seemed, this is 1960 when I'm 10 years old. And then only a few months later, my father came home from work one day and said, you know, we're going to go to Israel for a year. I got a sabbatical year at the Weizmann Institute. He was a physicist. So amazingly, there we went, and I spent that my 6th grade year in the city of Rehovot in Israel. in sixth grade in an Israeli school, and I just felt so deeply at home and connected with my true self and who I was as a Jew, and it made me very proud and uplifted. But I had no interactions with Palestinians, either Christians or Muslims, even though they were there and in the area. Family returned to the States after a year, but I vowed that I would go back to live in Israel as an adult. I felt that was the only place I could be happy.
The first time I met a Jewish person was when I came to New York in 1971. My husband was a medical resident. He took me to the hospital's Christmas party. Half of the medical residents were Pakistani Indian and the other half were Jewish. And his Jewish colleagues were being very nice to me, very welcoming. How are you doing? Are you homesick? How can we be of help? And I was trying to reconcile my negative perception with the reality on the ground. Then I find out that the woman who lived upstairs in our apartment, who had taken me under her wing, was Jewish. My husband's boss, who was mentoring him, Jewish. I get pregnant, my obstetrician Jewish. I have a baby, my pediatrician Jewish. And then I end up buying a house in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Staten Island. I had no idea what I was getting into. I liked the house, I bought the house. My father, who was visiting from Pakistan, was very impressed. And he said to me, people of faith, no matter what their faith, make good neighbors. And this community will be good for you because they will raise their children well and your children will be in good company. He was right. I also got a bonus out of it. I no longer had to tell my children why we don't eat pork or why I don't have a Christmas tree in the house. How about your first encounter, Walter?
Well, I did move back to Israel as I had vowed at the age of 26, and I spent the next 3 years there, which in many ways were the happiest of my life. I became a journalist. I was living in the city of Haifa, which is in the north of Israel, and I was covering many stories. I was covering the whole north of Israel, including many towns and villages inhabited by Israeli Arabs or Israeli Palestinians, depending on how the term you used. And so I was going there to do interviews, but I learned it incredibly. Well, I learned a couple of things. One was that there was systematic discrimination that they were enduring as kind of second-class citizens of Israel. But I learned something even more powerful that has defined the rest of my life, which I call the transformative power of personal encounters. What do I mean by that? Well, in this case, I was going out there as a journalist, and I was interviewing, as I say, many Israeli Arabs, Christian and Muslim. And the thing just quickly went beyond just interviewee. We really bonded because I think they were very moved that I had come out as a Jew, as a Jew, to hear their side of the story, which I guess didn't happen that much from most of the Israeli media. And they responded very warmly to that, and they invited me into their homes to, for dinner and all these wonderful things. And so I was like so moved by that, and learned so much. And then I would go back to Haifa, where I lived, and I would talk to my friends and relatives, and many of them looked at me kind of with, I would say, condescension, and they said, Walter, you're a nice guy. You mean well, but you're a naive American. You don't really understand what's going on here in this country, which is Jew against Arab, to the end, essentially. And if they so they're pretending, they're pulling the wool over your eyes, essentially. And I had to take that seriously because, after all, I had only been in the country for a year, and these folks I was talking to had been there their whole lives. Maybe they knew better. But as I talked, I realized I started to ask them, well, were you ever in that village? I would name a particular village, and 99% of the time they would say, well, maybe I was there once. We stopped for gas, or bought falafel or whatever. So they hadn't been. And so it turned out that I had in my very short time there more meaningful, I think, conversations and encounters with Muslims and Christians than most of my Israeli Jewish friends and relatives had in their whole lives. And so, and therefore because they had not had those kind of encounters, they could keep this, unfortunately, this kind of blinders, which said that's the enemy. They didn't see that as an individual who with the same hopes and dreams and aspirations for their children that they themselves had. So that's when I realized how incredibly important it is to go out and encounter people face to face. And that really has defined much of the work I've done ever since.
So for me,
Yes.
that encountering began by the sidewalk. In the 1970s, I was a homemaker raising two young boys, and I and my Jewish neighbors, we would be standing outside on the grass chatting. And I guess that's where grassroots movement started. We'd be watching our children. I must have invited them over for dinner. The conversation must have led to dietary restrictions. And now we are saying, oh, so you don't eat pork either, and is halal the same as kosher? She must have invited me over for coffee, and I would have said, I'm sorry, thank you so much, but it's Ramadan. What is that? And that's how the interfaith dialogue started. At one point, I realized that wouldn't it be nice if my Jewish friends could meet my Pakistani Muslim friends? Because I didn't want my Jewish friends to believe that perhaps I was unique and I was not like the rest of them kind of Muslims. And I also wanted my Muslim friends to meet my Jewish friends. So we would gather in our living room, and eventually these gatherings moved into bigger spaces, larger spaces, public spaces. Walter, your approach to interfaith dialogue was more top-down, right?
Well, in a way, because I continued to work as a journalist, so I met a lot of I covered a lot of amazing stories and met a lot of amazing people. But it did provide me with this opportunity for this, and I came back to the States, and I worked for 30 years covering the Middle East peace process, mostly from New York. There were other places, but mostly from New York at the UN. And that was kind of my mission, covering that, and I believed in it deeply. And then, unfortunately, tragically, in the early 2000s, the whole thing just crashed and burned, and I felt really bereft. And and then somehow I became interested. I became involved in Muslim-Jewish coalition building efforts in New York at the beginning as kind of an alternative path to peace and reconciliation. And then a few years later, in 2008, I was lucky enough to be hired by an old friend, Rabbi Mark Schneier, who's an Orthodox rabbi and president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. And I had the position as Muslim-Jewish program director. And I stayed there for almost a decade. And look, the job was incredible. First of all, I had to define what the job was, because I was probably the only Muslim-Jewish program director in the world. It was a funny title. And what we came to define it as was that my role was really to go out and connect people, to connect rabbis and imams, and then later Muslim and Jewish leaders, to get them to do joint programs together, which we called twinning programs. As Colleen mentioned, I organized many twinning events where you would get a mosque and a synagogue together, or you would get a Muslim and Jewish women's group together to do a program. And we would do these twinnings usually in November. So we called it, the weekend of twinning or the season of twinning. And we grew that over the years. And it was just an incredible a job. It was just a wonderful thing that I felt that I had the chance to bring together these, wonderful people. These, first of all, these individuals, many of them learned and fascinating rabbis and imams, and they would come together, and and then they would bring their congregations in, and it was just so powerful and moving and incredibly successful, much more than I expected it would be. And I said, wow, I really, feel, some days I would get up and I'd say, I really feel like I'm doing holy work.
Yeah, so that holy work had some ground rules. We would focus in our discussions on our commonalities, our shared history, our shared values, and we kept politics off the discussion. In fact, I belong to the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, where we have very clear guidelines that in the first 18 months, we will not discuss politics. Give relationships a chance to develop, give trust a chance to develop. So in my case, after the first 18 months were over, we still did not discuss politics. Things were going so well that we did not want to rock the boat. Last year, when the conflict broke out in May, we did talk about it. And we were given some very clear guidelines on how to broach the subject. In some chapters, it worked out well. In some chapters, it did not. and some chapters had to go on a hiatus. So since then, the sisterhood has done some extensive training in conflict resolution, in how to approach difficult subjects, in taking us on virtual tours, so that now that the conversations are taking place, they are moving in a direction where we want to go. So that is a positive outcome that has come out as a consequence of some very turbulent times. Walter, you want to talk about how our paths crossed?
So our paths crossed in 2009 or 2010. I wish I remember exactly which. But I that one morning picked up the phone to call Daisy Khan, who was then the president of the American Society for Muslim Advancement in New York, and who I wanted to help organize a twinning. And instead of getting Daisy on the phone, I got Sabeeha, and who turned out to work very closely with Daisy at the American Society for Muslim Advancement. And so we began talking and we became friendly, and then we started seeing each other at some of those twinning events that I was mentioning to you. And, you know, we had a really nice relationship. But I don't think that at that point, 2010, 2011, we had any idea where the relationship would lead us.
Where the relationship led us was that in 2016, my memoir was being published, Threading My Prayer Rug. And it occurred to me that it would be a good idea to have a blurb from a rabbi. And I thought of Walter, who is not a rabbi, but he worked for one. So I emailed him and I told him that my book is being published. And do you think that Rabbi Mark Schneier would be willing to write a blurb? And Walter's appropriate response was, I have to read the book. So I emailed him the manuscript. And this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday going through the manuscript, writes back to me and says, Sabeeha, the rabbi will be happy to do a blurb, and I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book? Walter, why did you come up with that idea?
Well, I love Sabeeha's book. So I hope some of you will, if you haven't read it yet, will pick it up. Just a great story of the immigrant experience. In her case, Muslim American from Pakistan coming to America and helping to upbuild the Muslim community. It was just a wonderful book, very witty and thoughtful and many things. So I said, oh, wow, and she writes very well. So I said to myself, wow, maybe this is because I had been looking for a Muslim co-author for a while. And so I said, here she is. I had been doing that because I've been for some years wanting to write a book with a Muslim co-author that we would talk about the success of the Muslim Jewish movement that we had both been involved in. And so I felt that was very important to get that story out there into the public space because too few people know about it. But then by the time Sabeeha and I began talking seriously about writing this book, it was already 2016, 17. And at that point, with what was going on in the country, I felt that it was very important that our book should also be a manifesto of why a Muslim-Jewish alliance is so needed at a moment in history when both communities feel threatened by the rise of bigotry and authoritarianism. And as the two largest minority faith communities in America, we Muslims and Jews must stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, all of which make Muslim and Jewish life viable in this country. So Sabeeha agreed to try, and we sat down with a tape recorder in the spring of 2017 in her lovely apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And we decided that as we talked, we decided that there's 4 principles that we would like to flesh out in this book a little bit, because they're so at the core of both our cooperation and the larger Muslim-Jewish cooperation that we've been privileged to be part of. So we want to share them briefly with you here, but we hope you'll obviously read the book so you'll get a much deeper exposure. So the first principle is the saying that if you save one life, it is as though you saved the whole world. Now, it turns out that this saying is in both the Talmud and in the Quran. and it expresses the premise that life is sacred and that every human soul is sacred, and that's like very powerful and very important. And it shows there's a commitment to mercy, compassion, and justice, and the preciousness of every single life in both of our faiths. So that was very important. But the other thing about it was that until I got involved in this work, I had no idea. I mean, I've known obviously that it was in the Talmud. I've been hearing it my whole life, but I had no idea it was in the Quran. It didn't even occur to me. So when I heard it once at a public event, at a Muslim public event in New York, my mouth dropped open. So when I spoke to Sabeeha about this whole comment, she was quite surprised that it was she had not known it was in the Talmud. And I would venture that 90% plus of Jews and 90% plus of Muslims have no idea that it's in the other sacred text. So it's very, very important that we illuminate it, because it shows also how much we have in common, how we have these roots together that go back way, 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 way back. And much of that has been unfortunately lost, and we're not aware of it. So that was the first one. Sabeeha, you want to talk about the second?
The second principle is welcome the stranger. The Quran and the Torah both command it. My mother was a refugee, a stranger in her homeland. In 1947, India was divided by the British into India and Pakistan. And my mother and her family made the train trip from India over to Pakistan. On the way, trains were attacked by mobs and thousands of people were massacred. It was a long, terrifying journey. I detailed that in the book. Don't have the time to go into it right now, but she did make it across safely in her new homeland, where she was welcomed a stranger. She lived there, she thrived, and until her dying day, she believed that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. Now, fast forwarding to 2017 and 2016, actually, the elections have taken place, and now we Muslims have woken up the next morning, the morning after, fearing an existential threat. That day, my husband got a call from the rabbi in our neighborhood, the synagogue in our neighborhood. And he said to him, I'm going to read a bit from Welcome the Stranger. I have never been inside a mosque. My husband called the Islamic Cultural Center of New York and made an appointment for the rabbi to meet with the imam on Friday. Should I remove my kippah? The rabbi asked as they entered the mosque. Keep it on. The rabbi was very noticeable as a Jewish person. He sat down on the prayer rug beside my husband, listened to the imam's sermon, stood shoulder to shoulder with the congregation in prayer. As soon as the prayer was over, people started walking up to the rabbi. Thank you for coming, they said as they shook his hand. A distinguished-looking elderly man dressed in a white shalwar kameez walked up to the rabbi. I would like to give you a gift, but I have nothing on me. He then held out his hand and showed the rabbi his prayer beads. This is a family heirloom, and I treasure it, and I would like you to have it. And he put it in the rabbi's hands. In those dark days, we witnessed many silver linings. Wasn't it Martin Luther King who said, only in the darkness can you see the stars? Walter, your mother was a refugee too, right?
She was. My mother was a refugee actually from Nazi Germany, who fled from Germany as a 14-year-old girl with her own mother into Belgium in 1938, and that commenced a journey that took about almost 3 years before they were able to get to the States, and that journey is detailed in my book, so I won't go through it. But they went through so many things in terms of being extorted and smugglers and all of that, and also the indifference, unfortunately, of Americans. They couldn't get. They were in Lisbon and they were worried the Nazis would come there, but they couldn't get visas because there was a long waiting list for Jewish emigres at that point, Jewish immigrants. Despite the emergency, despite the fact that the Jews were being murdered in Europe, the US basically turned its back. That was the first time of America First, which was actually the movement that opposed bringing in any immigrants except white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or Nordic or Norwegians and Swedes and so forth. So my mother got here by the skin of her teeth, and she was actually, when she arrived at Ellis Island, she and her mother were supposed to go on to Ecuador, but because they hadn't gotten American visas. So she was held, but my grandmother had a prearrangement. She was met by a Jewish immigration agency. She was taken into the city and managed to find someone who would be willing to sign an affidavit for them with the same last name. But my mother, who is now 16, was held at Ellis Island for more than a week while this was all going on in the city on her own. So that's how my mother got to America. She lived a long life and a very happy life in America, and loved this country dearly, and also worked to better it. And she was involved in the civil rights movement, for one thing. So then she passed away in 2005, and in 2018, I had the great privilege, was really one of the high points, I think, of my life in some ways, of being asked to speak about my mother, to tell this story in front of the Supreme Court, of the US Supreme Court in Washington, because they were considering whether or not to allow the Trump administration's Muslim ban to stand. And tragically, they would rule a few weeks later, 5-4, that it was somehow constitutional. And I think it was an obscenity. But in any case, I told this story about my mother at that time, and I said, you know what? All the terrible things that happened to her in those years are happening to Muslims today. People fleeing from Syria, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Yemen, and just as she had such a hard time getting here, they're being now turned away again by a new, American, America First kind of philosophy, which being evinced by this administration. So, and I said, I can't stand when I hear the president of the United States sneering and talking about illegals. Well, my mother wasn't illegal when she landed at Ellis Island, and she was able to stay, and she did a great deal for this country. And I'm sure many of these people would as well. So that's why Welcome the Stranger is so important to us. The third principle that Sabeeha and I wrote about is we call Islah and Tikkun Olam. So Islah is an Arabic word which translates as reform, to improve, to better society. Tikkun Olam is Hebrew for repairing the world. And to me, these concepts, which are very close, convey the common moral imperative in both of our faiths to help people who are in need. And so many of our events that we've done, many of our twinning events, we bring together Muslims and Jews to feed hungry and homeless people, to visit the sick and elderly, to clean up, parks, derelict parks, many things like that. And it's so empowering to stand side by side in a homeless shelter, a Muslim man and a Jewish woman, or side by side, serving hot food, stew to homeless people. There's something so primal that it really connects us with that common moral imperative in both of our faiths. So that's the third one. And Sabeeha, can you share the fourth?
So the fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. And again, I'll read a piece from the book, from the chapter Standing Up for Each Other. On a bright sunny Sunday in February 2017, soon after the travel ban was announced, my husband and I stood in Times Squares amongst thousands waving posters, "Today I am a Muslim too," except that they were not Muslims. These were Americans who had come out into the streets to stand in solidarity with their fellow Muslim Americans. It had been organized by Walters Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. I stopped in front of a lady in a wheelchair. She must have been in her 90s. She could barely lift her head. Think of what it took for her to be there. Someone must have helped her get into her heavy coat and woolies and put her in a wheelchair, taken her down on the sidewalk, gotten a cab, had her sit in the back seat, put the wheelchair in the trunk. All of that reversed all over again in Times Square. And there she sat, speaking, protesting loudly with her silent presence. These people, thousands of them, could have been anywhere on that Sunday, their day off, but they choose to give up that day and come and stand in solidarity with their fellow American Muslims. And then, not long afterwards, the tables were reversed. And now it was time for the Muslims to stand up for the rights of their fellow Jewish Americans. Tell us about it, Walter.
On October 27th, 2018, I woke up, I think it was a Saturday morning, and I, turned on the TV over breakfast, and I was just horrified to see on the TV screen that they were showing images, and they were telling the story that a neo-Nazi had broken into the Tree of Life synagogue in my hometown of Pittsburgh and slaughtered 11 Jews at prayer. And that was a really shattering experience for, I think, all American Jews. I experienced it by saying, for the first time in my life, I think I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. That I had never had that feeling before. And as I'm sitting there and sort of, just in shock and despair, I see on the TV screen a group of men in Muslim dress who are standing outside the police line, just out, across from, right near the Tree of Life. And they're holding up posters saying, please we love you, we're here for you, tell us how we can help. It was very powerful. They were from the Islamic Society of Pittsburgh, and it turned out that the two congregations had a twinning relationship. Not one that I personally had created, but there it was. That was very, very powerful. And then they began collecting they held a press conference from the Islamic Society of Pittsburgh, and they said, we're going to open a fundraising drive for the Tree of Life for this shattered community. And within it quickly became a national Muslim fundraising drive. And within a couple of days, they had raised more than $200,000, as I recall. So again, very powerful, very, very moving. And then the following Shabbat, the Saturday service, there were services across America in tribute to the Tree of Life. I went to, and it was incredible, the numbers, thousands of non-Jews, both Muslims, Christians, and others, just spontaneously came to these services, and they were welcome. It was terribly moving. And the Muslim involvement was huge. And at the synagogue that I was in Northern Virginia, Reformed Synagogue, I went there, and it was just, I found myself I couldn't get into the sanctuary because I got, it was already filled up, and we was kind of in the hall. And I was surrounded by hundreds of Muslims all around me. We were all packed together like sardines. And I talked to one man, who was next to me, and he had his two small children with him, a boy of about 10 and a girl of 8, approximately. And we, at one point, we just kind of we looked at each other, and I was so moved. I just kind of reached out to him, and I gave him a hug, and I said, I'm so moved you're here. But I just want to ask you one question: is what made you decide to bring your kids? Because this is obviously quite a heavy thing that they're being exposed to here. And he looked at me sort of like, how could you? He said, look, it's so vital for me. If my brothers and sisters are under attack, I have to be there, and they need to be there. They need to see this. This needs to be a life lesson for them. And I looked at them, and I could see that it would be. And that was just an incredibly powerful moment for me. And it's a little bit about what Sabeeha mentioned, the light in the darkness of Martin Luther King and so forth. It felt that way with me, and it really gave me hope to keep on with this work. And ever since.
This work has not always been easy. One of the challenges that I have faced and continue to face is to get members of the Muslim community involved in activism and in interfaith dialogue. I am not sure what the reason is. I'm told that we are still a young community, and now I'm talking about the immigrant community, that we have not yet quite evolved to the degree where we can get active in activism. It could be that. But I think there is also a degree of mistrust which gets in the way. Walter, have you experienced that?
Oh, yes, I have. I've seen that with in some cities with Muslims who have held back, and in some cities that I've worked in Muslim-Jewish relations, I've seen the Jews hold back. And you know, there's you know, again, fewer held back than got involved, but yes, that problem certainly existed. So we, you know, Sabeeha and I asked ourselves why, or, you know, and it seemed to me that in many cases, it really was about the elephant in the room, coming back to the Israel-Palestine conflict, because it would often, this kind of pulling back would often happen around when there would be upsurges of violence, like we're seeing, unfortunately, now. So I oftentimes, you know, for me, I experienced this very viscerally, because I was, you know, charged, my job was to build these twinnings, and I would see, I would call the rabbi in Los Angeles, and I would, you know, maybe in September, and I would say, you know, how have you talked to the imam about what you guys will be doing this in November, you know? And he would look, and he would kind of turn red. I remember one particular moment, but there were other moments like this. So he turns red and he says, you know what, Walter, I'm embarrassed to tell you, I haven't called him yet. And yeah, he said, you know, the thing is that because of what's going on over there, it just is really awkward. I just don't know what to say. I feel bad. I don't want to, you know, and so I kind of put it off. You know, I'll do it next week, then I'll do it next week. And I looked at him and I said, you know, just pick up the phone. You guys have already built that relationship, and, you know, you need to go on with it. And you're in a position to sort of talk about it and deal with it. But if you don't pick up the phone, you know, that won't happen, and then nothing will happen, in a sense, with you know, all the work we've done, all the beautiful work you've done together will be lost. And he would say, you're right, and they would go forward. So those things happen. We were able to, and we continue to be able to, as Sabeeha said, to overcome that difficulty, but it's definitely out there. And so we have, so, and given that, and we have some other thoughts we want to share with you now to close, which is the road, you know, some lessons that we've learned in our work together, and how we can apply it to strengthening our relationships. So do you want to start, Sabeeha?
So the first lesson that we have learned is that we are Americans first. While the Israeli-Palestinian conflict matters to us greatly, we live here, not there. And our own homeland of America is threatened unless we unite to save democracy and pluralism. We know what happened on January 6th. We know that was just a prologue of things to come. And if voting rights and everything else that we see happening continues to materialize, we communities, particularly the minority faith communities, will be the ones who will suffer. It will fracture our relationships. It will fracture democracy. So we need to come together. The second lesson we have learned is to speak out and stay engaged together against injustice, both at home and abroad. Walter, you want to pick it up?
Sure. So we've come to the conclusion that we can't avoid the elephant in the room, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but there is a way we can perhaps turn it in from a net negative to a net positive, which is that together, Muslims and Jews here in America can support the work of NGOs in Israel and Palestine, working to improve conditions on the ground and to save lives. And I've been personally very involved in the group called Project Rosanna, which works in healthcare, improving the healthcare situation in both Israel and Palestine, but especially in Palestine. And one of the things we do is that we have volunteer drivers who pick up children who need treatment, and they need to be treated for cancer or kidney dialysis. They're in the West Bank, and we help them to get, the volunteer drivers drive them, the Palestinian drivers drive them to the checkpoints, to the border, and we get them across, and the Israeli drivers take them on to the hospital. So that's just one example. So with that's an opportunity for the drivers to connect with the passengers and build relationships, and, you know, but most importantly, to save lives. So that's one of them that we think that, and by doing that, you know, by supporting groups like Project Rosanna, and there's many others, we really can get some skin in the game. So together we can help to improve conditions over there Instead of doing that, let's do that. Let's save lives. Let's build, rather than having the 633rd sterile debate about who's right and who's wrong. So that's one. Another one is we need to allow others to speak up, whether we agree with them or not. So many Jews, including myself, are uncomfortable with things that Representative Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have said over the last few years about Israel. And we think some of it is insensitive. But I would maintain that they have as much right to advocate for Palestine in the halls of Congress as do Jewish members like Senator Chuck Schumer or Ben Cardin or Representative Brad Sherman or Lee Zeldin or whoever. There's many more, obviously, Jewish members of Congress than Muslim, but that's changed. There now are some Muslim ones, and we have to let them, speak up freely too. And then, very, very important, we can't allow Israel-Palestine issue to be weaponized in ways that drive our communities apart. And we see this happening all the time. And sometimes it's done, to drive us apart. But people on both sides will pick this up and go with it and forget that that as bad as that's very important. But we also need to maintain our relationship here. So, for example, recently, the director of the Council of American Islamic Relations in Oakland, California, got big headlines late last year when she urged Muslims not to work with what she called polite Zionists. Her name is Zahra Bilou. She was saying that you can't work with them, because of what Zionists over there are doing to the Palestinians. But the problem with that is that if you won't work with Jews who are Zionists who love and support the state of Israel, you're ruling out more than 90% of the Jews in America. So that's effectively that kills our work. But there's many other examples on the Jewish side where Jewish organizations have taken stands or promoted legislation that really I think limits debate, limits discussion, in terms of saying anything about Israel. So just one very quick example. This was a Muslim woman who serves on the Fairfax County Board of Education in Virginia, a big suburban county outside Washington. And last year, and she had been working with the Jewish community, with the Jewish Community Relations Council together to get Muslim and Jewish holidays recognized by the public schools. And that was a great thing. And then when the violence broke out last year, she made a statement, or she didn't even make a statement. She put something on her Facebook page about how Israel had desecrated the Holy Land by attacking a Muslim incident inside and alongside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the holy site of Islam in Jerusalem. And again, I didn't like that language, but I understood where the pain she was feeling. The Jewish Community Relations Council broke all the relationship they had with her, and they claimed that she really had, she was an anti-Semite, and that she had, quote unquote, disenfranchised, their words, the Jewish students in Virginia, even as though those students are somehow appendages of the state of Israel. It sent a chilling message to other Muslim leaders who had worked very strongly with the Jewish community that, well, if you say anything, critical of Israel, we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. And that really is a chilling of discussion. So that should not happen. Sabeeha, do you want to finish up?
Yeah. So number 6 is, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. Activists like Linda Sarsour correctly demand that they be able to speak freely as proud Palestinian Americans, but we disagree when Zionists are demonized. Number 7 is that Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists rather than exclusively allying themselves with anti-Zionist fringe groups. Likewise, Jews should engage with Muslims like Tlaib, Omar, and Sarsour, with whom they share a common cause for improving situation in the United States here at home. We should be able to dialogue and work together with people with whom we disagree with on the Middle East issue, but agree with on projects right here at home that are of common interest to us. And finally, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. We acknowledge the sensitivities on both sides, but criticizing Israel's policies and its leaders is just that. It is not a criticism of all Jews, and criticizing Muslim leaders and their policies in Muslim majority countries is not Islamophobia. Yet we do need to be mindful and sensitive to the sensibilities on both sides so that our comments are not misconstrued as being either anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, particularly if they were not meant to be as such. And with that, we bring our presentation to conclusion. And then we would like to encourage you to read the book, We Refuse to Be Enemies, How Muslims and Jews Can Make Peace One Friendship at a Time. There's a whole lot more that we didn't have a chance to cover that you'll find of interest in the book. Pick up this book from your library and please consider picking it up. And it's a request. And if you like the book, then do consider giving it as a gift to your friends, particularly with the July 4th coming around the corner. It'll make a nice Let's Celebrate the Diversity of America book. So do consider helping spread the word by reading and promoting the message of the book. We really appreciate that. But thank you for coming out and listening to us and sharing your comments.
Thank you so much, Sabeeha and Walter. Really, we appreciate you sharing your experiences and wisdom with us. It was inspirational and insightful. So we're very grateful to you, and especially for offering us examples of how we can come together and appreciate one another. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks to our friends for sponsoring the program, and we appreciate you. Everybody have a good evening. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.